Hey guys, my name is Casey. Today I'm going to be talking about the article An Argument for Terrorism by Richard Jackson. So he starts out by explaining his goals and what he hopes to accomplish by the end of the article. He starts out by writing, "This paper argues that despite a number of serious political and ontological obstacles to the definition of terrorism, it should be possible to agree on a clear set of criteria that can be employed to distinguish and conceptualize terrorism as a unique form of political violence." So he talks about this paper will discuss main challenges in defining terrorism and the kinds of knowledge and practices that have resulted in to date. It outlines a set of criteria that analysts can employ to distinguish terrorism from other forms of political violence. It also demonstrates how this approach to terrorism can play a role in strengthening rules and norms against the illegitimate and oppressive forms of political violence. So he also explains that there are four main approaches towards the definition and conceptualization of terrorism. Number one is the use of the term without defining it, with a misguided assumption that it's widely understood and accepted. So scholars will use this term terrorism, but they never give a clear definition in their use of the term, and they just automatically assume that it is widely understood and accepted in the same way. Number two is that scholars will define terrorism as an ideology or a movement. The third approach is that they'll adopt an actor-based definition where terrorism is defined as a particular form of political violence committed specifically by non-state actors who attack civilians. And the fourth approach is that it is defined as a violent strategy or tactic that actors employ in pursuit of particular political goals. It's defined and understood by the nature and characteristics of the act itself, rather than rather than towards the nature of the actor. And it's conceived as a particular kind of political action directed towards certain goals, other than a broad ideology or movement. So then he goes on to argue certain reasons as to why we should retain the use of the word terrorism. For one, the term has widespread political and cultural currency. So it's used all the time. You hear about it all the time in the news, in political debates and discussions. So it's widely used already. It's also the organizing concept for a vast array of political organizations, processes, practices, and contemporary society. So all around, we have policies in place, we have governments, we have military that are employed specifically for and around the use of this concept of terrorism. So he says that it would be foolish to eliminate the use of the word completely because it's already used, and we have many organizations and things to based off of terrorism itself. And finally, the term also has a lot of academic currency because there's a whole field of research. There's classes like this course that we're learning about it, teaching, and there's advocacy surrounded by the concept. So that's why he says we should retain the use of that word specifically. Then he goes on to describe that as a form of political violence, terrorism can be described according to four main characteristics. Number one is that terrorism is an intentional and predetermined strategy of political violence. So this characteristic implies that any actor, be that a state, group, or an individual, can employ it in pursuit of strategic goals. It also implies that actors can abandon its use at any time, and that being labeled a terrorist is not necessarily a determinant of future behavior or an indicator of evil nature. This also implies that it has political motivations and that it is forethought and intentional in the use of this characteristic. Number two is that the targets of terrorist violence are not necessarily the victims of the violence itself, but rather the audience to the violence. So from this perspective, it's a form of political communication rather than a direct military action. Victims are chosen for symbolic reasons, not necessarily to degrade the ability of an enemy of sorts. And number 3, the third characteristic is that terrorism is intended to cause fear and to intimidate. And the fourth characteristic is that terrorism is aimed primarily, but not solely, at civilians. So this criteria provides a strict way to evaluate the actions by any and all actors who are in conflict. This criteria provides the potential to strengthen the norms relating to the limits of political violence, which improves human and social security. And to make this work, if we go with these characteristics that he lists, the author says that scholars would need to adhere to a set of core ontological, methodological, and normative commitments. So these scholars, in order to apply this and go with these characteristics of the word terrorism, of that definition, they would need to commit to certain things. So these would include an acute sensitivity to the to the politics of labeling in the terrorism field, and an acceptance of the insecure ontological state of the term. It would also include transparency about their own values and political standpoints, particularly as they relate to the geopolitical interests of the Western states. And also a willingness to expand their focus of research to include the use of terrorism by states, including Western states involved in operations overseas. And finally, an adherence to a set of responsible research ethics, including a commitment of refusing to cooperate with state counterterrorism that includes the use of torture, illegal practices such as victimizing whole suspect communities, and a commitment to normative values which reject any and all forms of civilian-directed violence and which promotes a broad notion of human security. So this is what he agrees on, that terrorism scholars must recognize the cultural, political violence, political biases that they hold, and aim for consistency of the application of the criteria that was set out. So this is what Jackson explains in his article, and I hope that was useful information. Thank you.